So tonight we have, I think all the women are here that are supposed to be here tonight. So we have 4 books that we are going to talk about, and I'll just read through them quickly. One is Nepal One Day at a Time, One Woman's Quest to Teach, Trek, and Build a School in the Remote Himalaya by Patti Lefkos. And I saw Patti come in. Welcome, Patti.
Thank you.
We have Unpacking for Greece, Travel in a Land of Fortresses, Fables, Ferries, and Feta by Sally Jane Smith. And Sally's up there at the top, at least on my screen. When I Was Elena by Ellen Urbani, who is here. And Edge of the World, Next Stop, Cape Horn by Coral Waight. So welcome, ladies. We're really happy that you're here. I thought we'd just start with asking each of you to talk a little bit about your book and why you wrote it. And then Jenny's going to do more of a facilitated Q&A. But if you could just introduce us to your book and your story, that would be great. And Sally, I am picking you first.
I was going to ask you beforehand not to pick me first. And I forgot. Okay, so my book is about traveling in Greece. In fact, yes, okay, all right, sorry. Just had a little flash of writer travel anxiety here. And I guess that's partly what my book is about. My experience of travel, like many women here, I've traveled a lot in my life. I've been very privileged to do that. And but back in 2006, I was in a very serious traffic accident when traveling solo in Sri Lanka. And after that happened, I found that I actually just lost. I just lost this passion for travel. And I say I found that, but I didn't realize that was happening because I was still traveling, but I wasn't traveling in the way I'd traveled before. I was going on cruises and traveling within my own country or with my family, all of which is wonderful. But I had lost that passion for taking on the world by myself in places that were unfamiliar to me, where I didn't speak the language, where I was unfamiliar with the currency, where I didn't know how to get my way around. And through a series of events that happened in my life when I was in my mid-40s, I realized I had to recapture this, and I went traveling to Greece on a mission to travel around Greece in buses, even the buses with the seat belts that came off in my hands and I was holding in my lap while the bus driver was, reading his travel manifest while steering through rainy roads. But something unexpected happened on that journey. What I hadn't known when I planned the trip was that my mother had gone to Greece for a few days back in 1978, and she'd written a travel diary. And my sister, I actually got it here in a plastic bag so I don't spill the water on it because I'm very clumsy. My sister had held on to this tiny little diary for all these years with my mother's very cryptic notes inside. And she gave it to me just before I left for the airport. And what happened when I was in Greece was not only discovering an amazing country, but also discovering a connection with my mother, who died when I was in my 20s, and with whom I'd had a very difficult relationship. And those various events combined to make this a trip that changed my life, and one that I needed to write about.
All right, beautiful story, Sally. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to ask Elena to share hers next. And by the way, we'll do some introductions as we're doing the Q&A. So don't worry, you'll get to meet everybody.
Sounds good. Hi, my name's Ellen, and the book I wrote is called When I Was Elena, about the years that I lived in Guatemala at the tail end of that country's civil war. I had joined the Peace Corps and moved to Guatemala when I was 22, straight out of a large sorority house in the deep South, straight to a mud hut with no latrine in Guatemala and lived there for about 2.5 years. And so the story is both a memoir of the years that I was there in Guatemala, but it's interspersed. Each chapter is bookended by chapters written in the voice of 7 Indigenous women that I met and befriended and lived alongside while I was there in Guatemala. So it tells both my story from my perspective as a young American woman living and traveling internationally, but the stories of these 7 other Indigenous women and kind of how our lives wound up intersecting while I was there. Just the quick version.
Wow, that's a very creative approach, I have to say. I'm sure Jenny will have some great questions for you on that. Let me just see. I'm looking at the names here. Who is there? Coral?
Yeah. Well, I'd always had a feeling sort of was drawn to Tasmania, which is the island state at the bottom of Australia. Quite often gets left off maps. A lot of people are drawn to Tassie, I think. I think it's the nature side of things, if you're that way inclined. But I've never had the chance, actually. Life kept getting in the way. And I think my children were sick of hearing about it, because for my 60th birthday, they gave me the fare for the ferry crossing. It's a car ferry across Bass Strait from Melbourne to the north of the island. It's a 9-hour trip overnight, and you drive on, go to sleep, and drive off, and it's fabulous. And they gave me some accommodation, and I added to that from my meagre resources of the time. And that was 13 days of driving around Tassie solo. And I planned to the nth degree, as I do, because to avoid surprises, I'm, a bit of a control freak, and I'm awfully dopey when I travel, so I have to do this. And so the lesson you learn is that you make your plans, and then, they don't happen. So the old saying, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And so I wasn't expecting to get stuck on the side of a mountain in the dark with my petrol tank on empty. My fault. I definitely wasn't prepared for the most violent storm of all time on the wild west coast in a caravan park, totally by myself, without a caretaker or anything. Or just forgetting I get seasick, and I always wanted to catch, a boat cruise around the south of Tassie, around Tasman Island. It's very wild. You're in the Southern Ocean, and it's the last stop before Antarctica. But I forgot, didn't I? So I spent the whole thing with my head in a bucket. So this is just the first trip, and I absolutely loved driving around Tassie, and so I went back 3 times. And with all the short stories that I gathered along the way, I just thought, well, what do I do with them? Could you stick them together, and would it be a book? So with lots and lots of editing and bit of help from a writers group, that's how I ended up with my book. What's it called? I've forgotten. The Edge of the World, Next Stop, Cape Horn. And the Cape Horn bit is a bit, it's not about Cape Horn. The idea of that is, if you get in a boat at Arthur River on the west side of the island and keep going, you'll hit South America without hitting land, without touching land. So you hit Cape Horn. So you're going around the sort of the bottom of the world, and that the idea is that that's how wild this place is. So yeah, that's how it all.
That's great. And you've written another book as well?
Well, I did the same thing. I then, I decided it was time I live alone. It was time I travelled overseas solo. And so I went to New Zealand first. It's the easiest way. It's only 3 hours across the ditch. And then to England and back to New Zealand, and did the same thing. Put the short stories, that I keep a diary. So I put the short stories together and ended up with 3 books Plus, they say if you want to sell books, you have to have a blog. So, and a travel blog. It's a big surprise to me. I never thought I was going to be a writer. So I'm as surprised as anyone else about this. Okay.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I can't wait to hear more. And then our fourth book tonight is Patti.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my books with you. I'm coming to you from my summer cottage on an island in a small lake north of Kingston, Ontario. So here's my story. After an incredibly fun and sometimes exhausting career in education in Ontario and BC, British Columbia, I celebrated my first year of retirement by going to journalism school for a year at the age of 60. I'd always wanted to be a writer, but never got time. So when the course was completed, that was April 2007, my husband and I, fellow teacher and mountaineer, moved to our home at Silver Star Mountain, a ski resort in British Columbia. And then I started my career as a travel writer and adventure travel writer. And since 2007, I've published about 200 articles in magazines and newspapers, local, regional, national, and a few internationally. And then I wanted more. So my first book is called Nepal One Day at a Time, and it was published in 2020. And it's a Himalayan adventure travel memoir, but with a humanitarian twist, which of course I didn't know about ahead. You see, I was about to turn 68 and life was kind of disintegrating around me. My best friend was ill. She beat cancer, but she was ill. My sister was diagnosed with early onset dementia. And then my husband and I were going to travel together to Nepal, but he ruptured his Achilles tendon. And I thought, I'm 68. If I don't go now, I might never go. So after long consideration, I left him behind, packed my bags, and headed solo for Nepal. And I was really hoping that I was still fit enough. I had a history as triathlete and cross-country ski racer, but that was like well in the past. So I hoped I'd be fit enough for trekking for 3 months. And solo travel did force me to surmount some daunting hurdles, physically and emotionally. When I was volunteering in a remote school, I was presented with a lot of challenges. I thought I still knew how to teach, but in a different country, in a different language, it was really difficult. And I got through it, and then they took me to a nearby village called Aprik, and the villagers asked for my help to build a school, and I left feeling like an imposter. Then later, while I was trekking in the high altitude Forbidden Kingdom of Upper Mustan, I suffered a frightening fall in an isolated cave monastery, 5 days walk from the nearest airport. And that's when I realized that I had real strength and determination and resilience. During those travels, I met fascinating monks and teachers and hotel entrepreneurs, and their wisdom provided me with some insight about how I could really help the kids that I had met and that village that asked for my help. So that solo journey really changed my life. The story inspired my nonprofit of the same name, and since we've raised funds to build a school in Nepal after the 2015 earthquake. So we have Devi Jal Kumari School in Aprik Village now enrolls 350 kids from kindergarten to grade 10. And to date, much to my surprise, Nepal One Day at a Time has sold 1,500 copies. And this week, even though published in 2020, is still rated as #1 in Kathmandu travel guides in Canada and #4 for Nepal travel guides in Canada. It's a great book for travelers, for armchair travelers, but it's also good for teachers and those wanting to volunteer in remote countries, in developing countries. And really, perhaps most importantly, all the book profits support education, healthcare, and home building in Nepal. And people who ask me sometimes if they read Nepal One Day at a Time, and people kept asking me, so how did you get to be the kind of person that would go off at 68 by yourself and go trekking and teaching in a remote village? So I answered that question with my second book, and it's called Grounded by Granite. And it's a coming of age tale of family connection and personal resilience framed by summers spent on this very island I'm sitting on now when I was a kid, in a small lake in the Canadian Shield in Ontario. It's a book for cottagers mostly, and those who wish they had a cottage, or those that used to and they have childhood memories of cottages, or just for parents who really want to get their kids out to spend less screen time and more time in the outdoors. So what's up next, you might ask? In late August this year, my husband and I are going back to Nepal to trek up to 800K of the Great Himalayan Trail. We'll be there for 4 months. I'll be 77 just before we leave, and he'll be 76, so he's fine, very young. So I'm about to start chapter 4 on the 3rd book, and it'll be called Nepal, It's Never Too Late, Discovering Love, Connection, and Personal Resilience on the Great Himalayan Trail. And I'm hoping to have it out by the end of December 2024. So thanks again for listening, and anybody has any questions later, I'm happy to answer them too. Thanks.
Okay. Do we not have amazing women here or what?
Yes.
I mean, oh my goodness. Yay. Yay to all of you. What wonderful stories. I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to kind of facilitate, because she's going to teach as well as she takes you through this and just ask each of our writers some questions. So as you're asking questions, or if you have questions, please do say who you are and where you're from, and let us just know a little bit about you so we can all kind of get connected. But thank you to our 4 amazing ladies for just kicking us off. Jenny?
Yeah, wow. What an incredible slate of writers we have. Thank you so much for all of these snapshots into your work. I'm Jenny O'Connell. I work with a company called Adventures in Good Company, and also on my own, just leading retreats where the outdoors and adventure meet creative writing. And that's my passion. I'm also a writer by trade. I write for local magazines in Maine and nationally as well. And I'm working on a journey memoir, an adventure memoir. So it's really cool to hear all of the great stories that are out here tonight. So I have many questions that are coming to my mind, but I'd love to just ask each of you a question about your book to get us started, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more. I know a lot of people here are writers or are interested in writing, and so maybe we can talk a little bit more about the process afterward. But Sally, my first question is for you, and it's around solo travel. So as a guide, I have led a bunch of different trips with women, with youth, with all sorts of people. And there's this interesting stigma around solo travel, where people are sort of, there's like this reticence to be by themselves or to like jump off into an adventure alone. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to Greece. It was a really beautiful way that you brought that up, where you had this sort of falling out with this relationship that you have to solo travel. And then you were intentionally building that back. So what spurred you on? What were you missing? What made you want to build that relationship back? And how did that process kind of go for you?
I think there's, excuse me, I think there's something about how the people you meet relate to you as a solo traveler, which I don't get when I travel in a group or with my partner or with family or friends. When you're a solo traveler, I'll give you an example. This example actually isn't set in Greece. This example is in Turkey, but it's what came to mind when you mentioned this. I went off to catch a bus in Turkey, and I got the times of the bus wrong. And I say a bus, when I say a bus, but I actually just mean a van of people that travel from place to place. And I ended up there hours early. And because I was alone, everyone in the bus station took me under their wing. I was sitting in the bus station. The old men called me over to share tea with me. A person selling cherries walked over and just dropped in my lap a double handful of these massive, luscious cherries at no charge to eat. Children came over and played with me. If I were traveling with somebody else, I probably wouldn't have had those interactions. So that's a very precious thing for me about solo travel. something else that's important for me about solo travel is the challenge of it, the challenge of finding your way alone around by yourself. And when things go wrong, you don't need to feel guilty that you've spoiled someone else's day. You can just laugh at what happened and turn around and find your way back again, or else just rejoice in the fact that you're in a new destination. You got there completely by accident, but you're in a new destination that you might never have found otherwise. Look, I guess a lot of writers are also introverts by nature, and I am an introvert. Being by myself and discovering a place by myself just re-energizes me in a different way from other forms of travel.
Thank you so much. I love what you said about the specific quality of sort of presence and openness that happens when you're by yourself, like the way that you're just a little bit more open to other people, or other people are a little bit more aware of you as an entity. And that's really beautiful. Thank you. And how cool that I feel like I'm an extrovert personally, but I have a lot of introverted, like dear close friends. And what an interesting way to sort of like flip travel on its head by intentionally going out alone as an introvert to kind of experience a place on your own terms. That's really, really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to say too, as we're talking, please feel free to add chats in the chat box. Like, feel free to sort of communicate that way, to add comments, or if things are coming up, other stories or ideas that you have. I just want to invite the whole room to sort of be part of the chat in the chat side. But thank you, Sally. So interesting. And I'm really excited to read more about your book. Ellen, my question for you, it seems like your book is very much focused around the people you met. You have sort of this like outward focus with your book around the process of telling other people's stories. And I'm curious, as somebody who kind of like picked herself up and plunked herself down in a completely different place in Guatemala, there's a lot, I'm sure, coming at you that you hadn't experienced before. And then you made these deep connections with folks there and wanted to help tell their stories. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the process of telling or helping to tell somebody else's story, both like the pitfalls and the triumphs of it. And also just what inspired you to do that. Why are stories so important to you? And why is it important to tell these stories of your friends?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question. And I think it ties interestingly into what Sally was talking about this idea of going off on one's own and being a stranger in a place with no one to rely on but yourself. I come at it from more of an extroverted perspective. And so for me, and I think also being young, I didn't know myself 35 years ago the way I know myself in my mid-50s now, right? And I went in large part to meet me. I wanted to see what I was capable of. I wanted to learn who I was under duress. But I immediately realized that I couldn't make my way through entirely alone. I couldn't do this by myself. And so for me, the largest part of that experience of that period of years in my life was about making connections with other people. And I think like anyone who is part of this organization understands the power of making connections with other women. And certainly as a young woman in a culture built largely on kind of a culture of machismo, my safety also was reliant on the company of women and women who would watch over me and who would take me in. And I was blessed that they were willing to do so. There were women who put themselves in danger to make sure that I was not. They opened their homes to me, their families to me. And it was an interesting thing. I think when I was in Guatemala, there was much that I failed to appreciate about the strength of the women who were there. I had been taught a very specific model of strength as a young woman coming up in America, this concept of if you don't like if you don't like what is happening in your country, you take to the streets, or you speak up, or you show up at a meeting, or you run for a public office. There are like, you make yourself heard. That was like my mantra as a 20-year-old young white woman in America. And I bumped into a very different concept of strength in Guatemala that I didn't recognize for what it was when I was there. But I came to recognize over, say, the decade after I returned, women didn't speak up, largely didn't speak up in the way that I was used to. So I thought of them as being voiceless. And it was only as I encountered some difficulties in my own life, as I kind of went through some of these stages of life that they were living through, parenthood, poverty, or trying to kind of scrape your way through building a home, building community, that I realized that they had a quiet strength that was in fact in many ways much more powerful than my very overt, like perceived, like loud voice. And it was over that period for the next 10 years that I realized I was holding these stories of these women who were not in a position to ever be able to tell their story themselves. Most of them were illiterate. They lived in countries where in a country where that opportunity simply didn't exist for them. They would have been in danger were they to tell some of their own stories from their own family or from their community or country at large. And I began to feel sort of this growing obligation in me to give voice for them to something that they couldn't give voice to themselves. And I would say that for me, the act of writing that was my first book. That first book it got to a point where I felt such a growing fire and yearning and obligation to share that I just couldn't not write. And so for me, it was a process of, I'd written before. I put myself through college writing features for magazines. And so writing was a creative act for me, but it was also something I was comfortable with. But I had a whole different job and a whole nother career. And so I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning before my husband woke up, and I would go into this little side room and light a candle, and I would sit in the dark by candlelight and write until the rest of my household woke up. And in some ways, it took me back to Guatemala. I hadn't lived with electricity for the most part while I was in Guatemala. So like the flame and the fire and the darkness, and especially the winters in Oregon where it was cold and it was raining out, it kind of just took me back. And much of my book was written with my eyes closed because I could be back there. I could see them again. I could see they were with me. I could see them. So it was a quiet act of reverence. In some ways, I could hear their voices. I could smell the tortillas cooking in their little outdoor kitchens. And it was like I was giving life to friends that I was never going to see again.
That's beautiful, Ellen.
I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love what you said about just the open way that you kind of learn a different kind of strength that you weren't used to, and I think that that's a really universal thing for a lot of people who travel. Like, we come in with these ideas from our culture, or these ideas that we're bringing in, and there's just so many other ways of being, and there's so many other types of strength and resilience and beauty to experience. And I think that's really beautiful. I love what you said too about the bubbling out of you. And there's actually a question in the chat that came up around, how did you decide you had a story that was worthy of a book? And I think that this is one answer, and we can toss this out to everybody as well. But this idea of, you called it a fire, like you said, I just couldn't not write. And that compulsion, that idea, that spark, is so inspiring. And I believe what makes a lot of really like transformative stories. So thank you for sharing that with us. That was really beautiful to hear about. I have a question for Coral and a question for Patti, and then we can get a little bit more into the writing process and the publishing process. Ellen, I also noticed you had a couple questions pop up in the chat, so feel free to answer them in the chat if you'd like to do that. But Coral, your story is so much about dealing with the unexpected, the kind of surprises that come up on a journey, including surprise joy, which I loved to hear about. I'm curious what you think travel experiences like this allow you to learn about yourself, or specifically what that brought up for you, what you feel like you took away from dealing with the unexpected on your own journey.
Well, I'm amazed by these wonderful adventures I'm hearing about, actually. What I brought away from my travels, do you mean? I think I always fought against rules and regulations. You know, I grew up through the 50s and that with very conservative family and church and all that sort of stuff, and never understood it. I didn't understand what the rules were for. I didn't need them. And so I kind of feel as if I've spent my life with people saying, how could people say to you, how can you travel on your own? How can you do that? And I go, well, you know, why not? You actually see more, I think, I find, since becoming a travel writer. I think now if I travel with someone, I get distracted. And so I do find, though, there's a bit of loneliness at night time when you're walking past cafes and there's people in there having their dinner and you've got your banana and your little yogurt and your bit of cereal for the morning. That can be a little, you can feel a bit of a victim there, and they go, no, I'm doing what I like. And, you know, it saves money. I don't want to dine out anyway. It's too expensive. But yeah, I am very much an introvert as well. So I'm trying to keep my brain working here because I'm not used to doing all this talking. So make allowances.
You're doing great.
I actually, my love in the past was performing, the performing arts, stage work, which you get a script for, and you know it's back to front and inside out. So, you know, that allows for no problems. And so I never, ever gave a thought to being a writer. It's just that I decided at some stage that I wanted to tell my own stories rather than someone else's, singing songs and that's someone else's stories. And so I started writing fiction, joined a writers group and started doing short stories and memoir. And in the meantime, went to Tassie, and I always keep a diary when I travel. So I just got my diary entries and made them into short stories to read at writers groups. And but I had so many, and there was so much work involved. And I thought, do I just leave them in the computer? Well, what's that about? So I thought, well, it's the next step and the next step and the next step. So that's all I've done. I've just taken one step and that's led to another and led to another. It turns out I can actually put words together. Well, people tell me they're okay, so they might take their word for it.
Claim it, Coral. You can. You clearly can. You just published a book.
Yeah, self-published, but still. Yeah, and I do like comedy, and I found the situations that I put myself in through my travels are sort of caused by myself a lot of the time. And I think that causes me to go in a different direction and go to, as has been said, go to a place that I wouldn't have gone to before if I hadn't made that mistake. And things happen to me. My phone wouldn't work when I went to England, and I was in a rental car that didn't tell me where to drop it off. And it's things that you really actually don't have control over. But then you just find out that you can handle them. They do work out. the end, and you get home and you're still alive, and all's well, and you just know that you can do it, and who cares how old you are, because it's nothing to do with anything, is it?
Yeah.
I don't know whether any of that made any sense at all.
Yeah. I love how the question about the unexpected that you encountered on your journey turned into the unexpected of the writing process. And that's what it feels like to me too.
True.
Sometimes I feel like I'm walking around in a dark room with my eyes closed. Like, what am I trying to say? Like, let's something rise to the surface here. Like, let's bring it up to the light. So thank you for sharing both of those, like the unexpected in your travels and also the unexpected in the writing process.
Thanks.
Really interesting to hear. Yeah.
Thank you.
Patty, I was really inspired to hear you talking about, this is a theme that comes up in my own book, which is the awareness of mortality and what we do with that information. So the way that we kind of integrate the idea that this is a short life, actually, and we don't get that much time. And so I love what you said about how it's never too late to be what you want to be, how you pursued journalism later in your life. And I'm really inspired by this idea of living a life like you're alive. And I think that that's really what a lot of JourneyWoman is about. I think that's what a lot of just like the travel that we are talking about is about. But I'm really curious about this sort of awareness of mortality for you and how that influenced your decision making and influenced the course of your book and your journey.
Good. I have two quotes that I kind of live by. One is a 90-year-old man who skied every day in season out of Vancouver, cross country, until he was 90, and his name was Ralph, and he was a prisoner of war, had been a prisoner of war, so he'd had a fairly difficult life. And he would go skiing every day. It didn't matter if it was raining out of Vancouver in the winter, still he would go. And he would say, stay positive and keep moving, baby. And I always remember Ralph when I'm a little tired and, you still got to go out and do it. And my grandfather, who lived to 103, said, if you think you're too old to do it, then you better do it. So those are the two. And, and we're thinking about goals. I'm just looking at what I've got hanging on the wall right here. You are never too old to set another goal or to dream another dream. That was C.S. Lewis. I don't know. Those are the things that I just think. That's why we're going to Nepal this year for 4 months. We can't wait for 2 or 3 years. You don't know what's going to happen. You have no idea. I mean, I am blessed with longevity in my family, certainly into mid-90s minimum, but that doesn't mean that's, we're not going to be in an accident or, My husband and I have been T-boned twice, like the car running into the side of the car, no fault of ours. Both times it hit me on the side. And that's, that's why I have a long history of physiotherapy for that. But yeah, if you sit around and don't do anything, you'll end up continuing to sit around, I guess, you just. And it kind of did shake me when my best friend had cancer. We'd gone, best friends since kindergarten. And she beat it, as I said. And then my sister, who was a teacher and a counselor, a yoga instructor, when she retired, she became a yoga instructor. And at 70, she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's dementia. And it was just horrible to see this wonderful, vibrant woman who, if I sang soprano, came in with the perfect alto. And, I just thought, boy, you don't know. We never thought that would happen to her. So you have to just go out and, overquoted as it is, carpe diem, get out there and do it. And my mission is to inspire other women to get out and do these things and to just leap out of your comfort zone. I was really afraid to go to Nepal by myself. And I sat down and I listed all the things I was afraid of. and what might happen and what I might do about it. And that seemed to make me feel a little bit better. But of course, I was still nervous and afraid. But, and you know, it's uncomfortable, you know, squat toilets in the middle of the night are not filling. You know, you got to make sure you got your headlamp and your toilet paper at all times, you know. But if you're able to do that, you can make a difference. Not just, you know, we built a school, yes, and we've built a couple of homes now, but also just by influencing and chatting with the people you meet, which is why solo travel is so wonderful, because you do talk to the locals and you learn more about the culture. You're invited in for tea and meals, and it's a whole different way of looking at things. You know, I had not done that because my husband and I like to do the same things. I'd traveled certainly within Canada on my own, you know, family or friends, to visit family or friends, but I hadn't needed to go on my own. And it was really, really good for me. It made a big difference in my life.
Thank you. Thank you. I love what you said about reaching through your fear. I feel like so many of my biggest experiences in my life have been when I'm afraid of something, and then when I stop and really look at that fear. And I think that as women, we've been given a lot of fear to hold that isn't necessarily ours, right? Like the fear of not being enough, the fear of our bodies in space. There's so many different fears. And so it's really beautiful to hear you talking about pushing through that, really like finding your groove beyond that fear. I love that. Stay positive and keep moving, baby. I'm gonna like, I'm gonna bring that home with me. I'm gonna keep that with me. But thank you so much for speaking to that idea of like the confluence of fear and mortality and the time that we have. I feel like a lot of the women that I guide on trips are often sort of reclaiming, they're taking ownership over their lives in a different way. They're being like, this is mine. Like, I want this back. I'm looking for a part of myself that I've given away to other people to like support them and to help them grow. But like, I want this for me. And so, yeah, just so beautiful to hear all of these stories. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are running a little bit low on time, but I want to give our writers a chance to speak to the writing and publishing process. I know we have a bunch of writers in this room. We have a bunch of people who are really into creative writing and potentially publishing. And so I'm just going to kind of open it up. Not everybody has to answer, but if you have something that you'd like to say, please feel free, about advice that you have for writers who are starting out in the writing process or who are starting out in the publishing process.
May I start?
Go for it, Patti.
Well, I did a lot of investigation into self-publishing, and part of being, you know, a woman of a certain age was I don't have forever to wait around for 3 years for some company to pick up a book. And so I decided to self-publish. And I started looking at the press companies that are self-publishing companies, but because I had magazine experience and a very good trusted editor from one main magazine I wrote for, and I had gone to conferences, they just said, you need a good editor, you need a good book designer, and you need a good cover. You don't need a self-publishing company to do all that. If you can find those people through, I'm part of the British Columbia Federation of Writers, for instance. All of those people have been vetted. So I would think my advice would be to be really careful about going with a big self-publishing company. But if you do it on your own, sure, it's harder and it's slow, it may be slower, but you know you're getting the exact service you want to get on your terms, on your cost. So.
Can I ask real quick, Sally and then Coral, are you all traditional publishing route or self-publishing route? Just have a sense of where we're at.
Oh, self-publishing.
And I've self-published as well. And I agree with Patti. There are a lot of vanity companies out there that do take advantage of writers. I'd like to I think there's been a self-publishing revolution, and it's really exciting. For a long time, I actually did think that that was the loser's way out. And I queried agents, and I queried publishers for years. And I'm very glad I did that, because the first time that I thought Unpacking for Greece was ready to be published, it really, really wasn't. I often say that the trouble with writing is that when you start, you think you're really good at it. And it takes years and years of working at the craft to improve, to learn and improve your writing skills. That those first drafts and the second draft and the 10th draft might not be as good as you think it is. So I'm really glad that I took that time. But the advice that I would give to writers is to find your community. Find your writing community and find your reading community. It's never too early to find those things. And by finding those communities, not only will they help you become a better writer, but they'll also give you the tools to do it yourself, and the understanding of what the pros and the cons are of both traditional publishing and of self-publishing, because there are pros and cons to both. Right now, there was a time, as I say, that I thought it was the loser's way out. Right now, if somebody came and offered me, I've got book 2 on its way, and if somebody came and offered me a traditional contract for that, I'd turn them down, because I've learned the advantages of doing it myself.
Interesting.
So
Ellen,
then,
go ahead.
and my experience is, so just a different one as the traditional publishing route. So I'm happy to field questions if people have some of those about that process.
Yeah, Ellen, do you want to talk a little bit about that process? That'd be
Ellen, me? Can you hear me?
Yes?
Oh, I
Yes,
was
Elena?
talking to Ellen Urbani, but you're welcome to weigh in if you have a question.
Can I say something
Yes.
about my experience? Well, I agree that you don't need a company at all to self-publish, and you have to have a really good editor. So I agree with most of what was said, but also the writing process, just start, just begin. And once you become a writer, whether or not you're published, you'll always be a writer, and you can't not be one, even though there'll be the slow and the dry periods. Like I've done 2 self-published, and I'm working on a 3rd, and I go in and out of the writing, sometimes months and months, and that's okay. And writing about where your heart is, which that's what you've been saying. That's what it's all about. You write from your heart and your guts.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, and I do want to let the other Ellen speak to the other kind of publishing process as well. I feel like as a writer and as somebody who has been in this kind of arena for almost a decade, which is probably less than what others have, I feel like there are many different routes to publish, and it really, like, the publisher that you choose is often the amount of support that you get in bringing your book into the world. And so it's sort of like, sometimes you have to do more of that yourself, or you want to do more of that yourself, and really like have that ownership over it. And sometimes with a more traditional publishing route, that can kind of fall to others. And you have kind of more marketing support or publicity support or whatever. So Ellen, I'd be curious if you want to weigh in on this, and then I know we're running out of time, but there's so many good questions here. I wish we had another hour.
Sure. And I'll keep it really short. You know, I think it does fall into these 2 camps, and there are pros and cons, as everybody's mentioned, to both. I went the traditional publishing route. I live in Portland, Oregon. I live here with a very large group of authors whom I esteem tremendously. I've kind of been lucky. They're part of my social life and my social world. And so for me, the people I am in touch with and associate with and friends with have all gone traditional routes. And so that was a model that I knew well and understood. Also, my work tends toward literary fiction, which is, I think, a little bit harder to self-publish. Works of literary fiction, you often need kind of more power behind them in terms of getting them out into the public sphere. And so for me, the traditional publishing route worked well that way. Also, like for Elena, both my books had big national tours. And I do a lot of speaking. And so having speakers bureaus and things like that that tied in with the publishing houses made sense for me. And then my second book that sold as well overseas and to international publishers. And that was actually something I think all of you would love, much like me, in that you wind up being on tour internationally and combining like the whole book thing with the whole travel thing made it really, really fun. And very fascinating to see how that process works overseas, and the world of book translation was quite a learning experience for me, which I loved.
Thank you, Ellen. So interesting. And I know we have a few minutes left. I'm happy to stick around if other people have questions. I do want to bump it back to Carolyn in a moment. But beforehand, I just wanted to thank all of our writers. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. It's really beautiful to hear all of these really different, really varied accounts of travel experiences. I am I'm guiding a creative writing trip in Maine this summer. So I'm just going to leave that information in the chat. If anybody's interested in joining, it's with Adventures in Good Company, which is a all women's company that I guide for. But yeah, it's kind of combining the adventures of Maine. So kayaking, a little bit of hiking, a moose safari. Fingers crossed, we'll see, with creative writing, because I think that the outdoors is a really beautiful place, and travel and adventure is a really beautiful place, a really rich place for creativity. So that's there. I'll leave my website there too, if anybody wants to connect around publishing or creative writing. But thank you so much for everyone. I hope, I think we have all the information on how to buy these books on the website. Is that correct, yes, Carolyn?
Yep. Yeah, and I hope we will buy these books and support these authors, obviously. And Jenny, man, you did a fabulous job. Thank you.
Thank you. It's what a joy to get to talk to all these writers. And I feel like there's so many good questions in the room and so many writers in the room. We could keep going for a while. So
we can keep going a little bit. So if you have to leave, feel free to leave. If you would like to stay and talk a little more, ask any questions, happy to do that. Because I would love to hear from also, I know some of you have done writing retreats, and I'd love to know
talk a little bit about, somebody asked the question about if you know when you have a story. And I'd love to talk to that a bit if anyone's interested.
So we can stick around for a little bit of Q&A. I just want to mention though, for those who have to leave, that we also have another author, Karen Gershowitz, that is going to be speaking in about a week and a half on June 5th about her book, which is called Wanderlust. And Karen's one of our writers, and also wrote a book I guess it was just last year, or maybe the year before, called Travel Mania. And she's already working on her third book. So she'll be available to answer more questions and talk about how she's been doing it. And then we have 2 meetups. I heard there were a lot of Toronto people on the call here. So one is coming up on June 3rd in Toronto, and the other is in Edmonton on June 3rd. And we're working on more for the summer all over the place. So so stay tuned on that. But anyways, if you'd all like to stay, somebody needs to ask a question.
My audio dropped out for a moment and I was talking. I hope I didn't talk over anyone, but I'd love to talk about, there was a question that was raised in the chat about how do you know when you have a story? And I think this is a really important thing for writers to interrogate about their work. So if anyone wants to have a chat about that, that would be great.
Yeah. Well, how did you know, Sally?
Well, I think at first I didn't. So when I started writing Unpacking for Greece, it was very much designed as a travel companion. It was first and foremost a Bill Bryson type travelogue. And I like to think that Greece was not just the setting, it was the protagonist of the story. It took working with editors, and I cannot recommend working with quality editors strongly enough. It took working with editors to understand that an account of a journey can read a bit like, okay, I'm going to be giving away my age a bit here, but you remember when you were kids, neighbors went away on a holiday and they came back with a whole lot of slides, and your parents used to take you
Yeah.
over to their house to watch the slideshow of their trip, right? Yeah. So when you write an account of a trip, it can be like that. It can be very like that. The trip might have changed your life, but until you learn the skills of communicating what's important, what was important about it, it can just read as a catalog of sites you visited and activities that you did, which might still be of interest to people who are planning a trip there or remembering a trip there. But the trick is to find the story, to find the hook, and to find the story that gives a shape to your narrative. So as well as, if you're a travel memoirist, people are coming to you because they want to learn about the destination, and that's probably what excited you enough to write the book in the first place. So absolutely, that's where you need to go. But as well as that, you have to learn about creating a narrative arc or a character arc. It doesn't need to be, the plot doesn't need to be as fast-paced as the latest best-selling thriller. Because it's a different kind of book. It's a different genre with different expectations. But there does need to be something, a thread that runs through it that makes it hang all together. In my case, those were the stories of my mother's diary and the stories of recovering my wanderlust after this accident that happened over the years. And it could take a long time. Ellen, you were talking about, I think earlier, you were talking about all these this growth that happened with you and your understanding of your story, how it didn't just happen during your trip, but it happened in the years after the trip.
Right.
And it can happen in the years of writing about the trip. Writing is an incredible way of learning to know yourself. And a lot of the realizations that I describe in the book, I might describe a moment of a realization that struck me in Meteora in Greece. And it's true. That realization did happen in Greece, but it was only the beginning seeds of that realization that happened in Greece. It was the years and years of writing about it that made me understand what had happened and why it was important for the story. But just because I understood it didn't mean that that was coming out of my work. And it took editors to say, but why should your reader care? Why? What is the real story behind this that brought it through? So yeah, work with editors. If you can't afford editors, work with beta readers. Ideally work with both, and they will show you where the gaps in your story are that you need to develop.
Can I add, I would, I think that the point you made about finding something substantive that ties things together and gives narrative to an experience is really, really important. I would also say that I think we need to be mindful that not every story that we want to write needs to be a book, right? There are so many ways of expressing ourselves. It's not like, oh, I have a story to tell and this has to be the goal. Writing pieces, whether they're published anywhere, in a book, in a magazine, that is one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is to be writing pieces that you're leaving for your family, or even just writing for yourself. And I don't want to discount the power of that, because I think that it's a really, really important thing. I think sometimes we think that every big experience, like it changed us, and therefore it deserves to be sent out to potentially change somebody else. And that's not necessarily true. I'm leaving in 2 months for a year of to try to cross the world. And I'm going to be camping across Africa for one season, crossing the Andes on horseback another season, some really big things that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And in the midst of this major transition in my life. And everyone I know says, oh, you're going to write another book about it? And I'm like, and my answer is always the same. It's, I haven't the foggiest idea. Because I don't know yet if there's anything that I will experience that will be worthy of needing to be in a book. While I know that nearly everything will be worthy of me hanging on to and learning from and growing from. But it doesn't mean that it has to turn into this kind of a product.
I love that, Ellen. I think that a lot of times our stories over time tell us what they want to be. Sometimes it's an essay, sometimes it's just a journal entry or something you share with friends. Sometimes it just keeps going and going and going, and it's a book. I love that idea of really listening to the story, and just like loving the experiences for what they are. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And seconding what Ellen says about writing short pieces, I think that writing short pieces really can train you. Train's probably not a good word, but help you to become a better writer. Many of us, myself included, we tend to use a lot of words around what we want to say. We tend to bury the story. We tend to put so much backstory in that we hide the essence of what we're trying to communicate. And coming to the discipline of short pieces, even if you're using an extract from your manuscript and you're transforming it into a short piece, can really help you to become a better writer. There is, I'm part of an online writing community called Binders, writing community of women. I have a few writing communities. The Binders groups are fantastic. Primarily traditionally published, a few self-published like myself, but fantastic group of supportive women. And there's a woman called Alison Williams who does a lot of work in supporting writers. And she really talks about how she's got a program called the Writer's Bridge, which is great for writers to get involved in. It's a free program. She talks about how social media posts can teach you to become a better writer. Because when you're writing a social media post, you're writing, you've got your hook has to be right there in those first 1 or 2 lines, because otherwise people are going to scroll on past what you've said, and you need to fit your thoughts into a nutshell. And that's where something that, it might not be a story that's worth a book, but it can reach people in other ways. You can write it there.
I think Sandy had a question. Did you?
Well, it's just Ellen and Sally, what you both said. Sally, you took your mother's journal with you on your trip, and that just hit me like a ton of bricks, because I have journals going back umpteen years, and I write a different one for every trip, or I continue with one. And Ellen, what you said is that it's either for you or your family, or it can just be your own personal writing. And I think that that's really important. My husband has asked me often, and Patti, you talked about, life does come to an end at some point. And he said, what do you want me to do with your journals? He's making an assumption here, right? But I want them to go to my children, and I do a lot of photo books as well. And I think that that's my way of keeping my passions alive in my children. I have one who loves to travel and one who's like, okay, you want to take me, that's fine. You don't want to take me, that's fine. But I think that that connectivity, especially reading your mom's journal, I mean, that must have been unbelievable. And then you went to Greece. And so to me, I see that connection in a lot of what I write about. And I just threw something else. And Carolyn, you may know her, Sylvia U. Friedman. She's part of the group that I'm with the Mekong group, and she had this writer on.
Oh yeah.
And she does hour-long interviews with interesting people, and I've been fortunate enough. And I haven't read Abigail's book yet, but the one thing she said is just write, and that has led me. And I've always had this book in my brain. I've had a couple of them, but this one in particular about my life's memoirs. And I just started to write. And what I found is I'm writing the travelogue of my life through my trips, through my travel, like not about, I was born on September the 12th, 1946 and blah, 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 blah. But it's about the trips I've taken. And it's about what they have inspired in me to move forward and that kind of thing. Versus writing on day one, I went to Notre Dame, on day 2, I went to, the Louvre or whatever. So this book, I haven't opened it. I just keep it on my desk and I have a sticky on it that says, and it was May the 3rd, and it says, just right, my life is a travelogue. And that both have said has just really resonated. And Coral, I've been on that Tasman cruise, and I get very seasick at the end. It's called Relief Bands. And that and going on that Tasman cruise, when he said we're not far from Antarctica, 3 years later we went to Antarctica.
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you get seasick?
No, because I had my relief band. And it
no,
really does work.
Don't work for people like me.
I
No,
just
drugs are the only thing that work, and you know, then they sedate you so that you miss out on what's going on. So
Yeah, that's not
I'll
fun.
have to work that out somehow or other.
Yeah, yeah.
Or I just wanted to add, I never imagined I would write a book. I was quite content writing articles, and then I kind of thought, I think like Ellen, as Ellen was saying, the stories didn't start about me, they were about all the people, all the interesting people and what the lives were like of some of the women in small villages in Nepal, or some obscure painter painting tanka paintings near the Tibet border. I wanted the world to meet these wonderful people, and somehow it all got together, and how they affected me too, and ended up in a book. I'm not quite sure how, actually, but yeah, there were so many people whose lives are so incredibly different from ours, and they're very, very happy. The Nepali people are incredibly welcoming and kind, and have very little, and welcome you into their homes. So I guess I wanted people to know about those things, and then it became part of the story. I guess I was inspired too by there's a fellow called Connor Greenan, who wrote a book called Little Princes, and he was a young man that went to volunteer in an orphanage in Nepal. And in the back of his book, it says, and 1% of the profits go back to the orphanage. And then that all came together with, maybe I could make something out of the book and make some money out of it for the children. So, but it's step by step.
Can I just ask quickly, why you chose Nepal rather than somewhere else?
Oh, the mountains.
Oh,
My
okay.
husband was a mountain guide before he was a teacher, and we've done a lot of hiking in North America and canoe tripping, wilderness canoe trips and stuff. And it's the mountains, yeah. Actually, we went to Tibet first, and then we realized that we would really love to volunteer in a school, but you really cannot volunteer easily in Tibet because of the Chinese oppression of Tibetans. And the rules and everything. It's just not easy to do. And Nepal is the other Himalayan country. And so that kind of got us started.
I wanted to follow up on something Sandy mentioned, and it was in terms of people asking kind of tricks and how do you kind of get started. She was talking about the journals and her family and her kids and those different ways of communicating. And one of the things I did when I went to Guatemala, I'd not written a book before. I had no intention of writing a book when I went, but I realized that I would want to remember these experiences, and there would be things that perhaps over time I would start to forget. And I'm not a journaler. I've never journaled, but I'm a letter writer. And I prearranged with different people in my life to save all the letters that I sent home to them and asked if they would return them to me when I got back. And I picked different people because I thought, well, the things I write to my mom about may be pretty different than the things I write to my college roommate about. So if I choose wisely, I might get all my stories coming back to me in the end. And so I had about 5 people, and they each gave me like a folder like this full of letters when I get home. And I actually just put them away, didn't read them, decided 10 years later I was going to write this book, and deliberately didn't read any of them until I had gone through and written the book first. And then I used them. I went back and fact checked based on the letters to make sure that the things I actually remembered really and truly lined up with what had happened in reality, or what was, I keep thinking about the truth.
Mhm.
What
That's
was
an
true.
amazing idea. I love it.
It
Fabulous.
worked really, really well for me. I will say the other really fascinating thing though is there was only one thing that appeared in the letters that I had not included in the book or like remembered and put in the book in terms of kind of seminal experiences. So my memory held up really, really well, but it was a great trick to be able to fact check my own stories.
I did something similar when I went to Guatemala. I've been to Guatemala, I don't know, 14 times. And every time I would send emails to my sister, long, detailed emails. And so I have all of those saved. And every once in a while I go back and take a quick peek at them. But it's the same concept, is that it's what you're telling somebody else you use as your basis. Yeah.
And also that brings back the emotion that you were experiencing at that time. Even social media posts. I'm a bit of a social media junkie, and social media posts from those days when I was just writing for my friends as opposed to writing as an author, the immediacy of the emotion, of the sensation, of the tastes, of the smells were coming out in those memories, and I was able to pick up from those and use them to add texture to what I had written, what I had already drafted. And Sandy, I think it's wonderful that you're journaling, because you're right. You have to start by just writing. And at the beginning, when you're just writing, you don't even need to think about whether it's good or not, or who's going to read it or not. Somebody very famous who I can't remember right now said, you can edit a bad page, you can't edit a blank page. So I think that to a large extent, one only learns writing by writing and then by editing and by looking back at it. And the writing that you leave, whether or not, as Ellen said, whether or not it becomes a published book, whether or not it's a journal entry, whether or not it's a letter, whether or not it's a diary that may be read by nobody else or may only be read a long time after you die, it becomes a very, very valuable resource. Because when we're young, we're not that interested in what our parents have to tell us. When we're older, we want to go back and we want to find that. And we want to find that both for the stories, but also to find that connection that we might never have had. I never connected to my mother as an actual woman, as opposed to my mum, until I started reading her journey and realized she was traveling at the same age that I was traveling. She was experiencing and finding herself in a foreign land in the same way, well, in a different way, but that quest inside herself to find something bigger was happening as well. And that was the first time that I recognized her as a woman. And we have, as a family, my great-great-grandmother wrote the story of her life on 4 continents in the mid-19th century, an incredible letter that's in a museum now. It's a 25-page, I think it is, handwritten letter, written in her second language, talking about her life, where she, moved from Europe to Africa to Asia to the States, where her husband was a mercenary in the Civil War. It's this incredible story. Now I can imagine that her kids were like, "Oh gosh, Mom's talking again," and shutting out. Her great grandkids consider this one of our most treasured possessions. So yeah, writing those stories is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, thank you all so
Beautiful.
much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you,
thoughts.
everybody.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
session.
Thank you.
Thanks
Wonderful
for
session.
being open
Thanks.
to this.
Yeah.
So this
Bye-bye.
will be on YouTube, and we'll share it with you, and you can watch it. And thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
We'll do
Bye-bye.
it again. Okay.
Thank you. Goodbye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.